National Women's Party Night of Terror. Alice Paul, an American suffragist and one of the main leaders that helped initiate the 19th Amendment, once said, "I never doubted that equal rights was the right direction. Most reforms, most problems are complicated. But to me, there is nothing complicated about ordinary equality." Up to their conflict of the Night of Terror, suffragists in the National Women's Party did not have the support of most people, including President Wilson, and to some were considered sinners, traitors, and dangerous. The compromise to the Night of Terror was increased support for women's rights and the passage of the 19th Amendment. The context for the Night of Terror began with the meeting of 300 men and women at Seneca Falls, New York, where the Declaration of Sentiments claimed women deserve equal rights. The movement was furthered by the passage of the 14th Amendment, which grants equal protection of the law for all citizens, including freed slaves. The suffrage movement was encouraged by Wyoming in 1890 and Texas in 1912, granting women the right to vote. Finally, in World War I, from 1914 to 1918, women were employed in non-traditional jobs and as a result were seen as more capable of managing the right to vote. In 1885, Paul was born into a Quaker family that taught her the importance of gender equality. In 1907, while studying abroad in England, Alice Paul was exposed to the British suffrage movement. Prior to leaving England in 1910, Paul joined the campaign for British women's right to vote. Back in the United States, Alice Paul attended suffrage meetings with her mother, Tossie Perry. After receiving her Ph.D. in economics at the University of Pennsylvania in 1912, Paul decided to turn all of her focus to the American suffrage movement. In 1913, Alice Paul moved to Washington, D.C. and joined the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and other members led the National American Women's Suffrage Association throughout protests and planned the 1913 parade in Washington, D.C. After joining this group of suffragists, Paul soon became leader of the Congressional Committee, where she met Lucy Burns. The National American Women's Suffrage Association was primarily focused on state-by-state campaigns. Paul preferred to lobby Congress for a constitutional amendment. Unfortunately, because of Paul's difference in approach and her other techniques, the Congressional Union and the National American Women's Suffrage Association disbanded. After being asked to leave by the National American Women's Suffrage Association, Paul left and was joined by her friend Lucy Burns, and together they formed the National Women's Party. The National Women's Party's more aggressive approach to women's suffrage led to the conflict of the Night of Terror. The Women's Party targeted Congress and the White House through a revolutionary strategy of sustained dramatic, nonviolent protests. Other techniques used by the suffragists included aggressive agitation, relentless lobbying, clever publicity stunts, and creative examples of civil disobedience and nonviolent confrontation. According to the publication, The Suffragists, leaders of the National Women's Party told all women that they must, with all possible strength, add their voices to this demand by telegraphing the president and getting the press to pressure President Wilson. Thus, increased tension created conflict. From January of 1917 up to the Night of Terror on November 14, 1917, the suffragists protested in front of the White House in Washington, D.C. These women were the first to picket the White House to force change. Suffragists took their protests to the White House because they felt that they had been ignored by President Woodrow Wilson. Because Wilson did not respond to the suffragists, they even burned copies of Wilson's speeches in front of the White House. The suffragists were seen holding banners colored purple, yellow, and white as a symbol of the National Women's Party. The banners asked, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for their liberty?" And "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" Although some people thought it was reasonable to give women the right to vote, others considered the suffragists traitors, so they ripped the banners and attacked the women. On July 14, 1917, 16 members of the National Women's Party marched to the White House gates, where they held a banner with the French Revolutionary terms "Liberty, Equality, Fraternity." All the women were soon arrested for obstruction of traffic, and 2 days later the women appeared in court. Each of the women gave short speeches in their defense, explaining why the charges against them were not necessary. The women elucidated that they were being charged only because President Woodrow Wilson was not willing to give women liberty. The court sentenced the women to serve 60 days at the Occoquan workhouse or pay $25. Rather than pay the fine, 16 women chose to go to the workhouse to get more attention for their cause. At the Occoquan workhouse, the suffragists had to give up all jewelry, money, handbags, letters, in fact, everything except the clothes on their body. At the end of 3 days, all 16 women were released. Warden Whittaker told the suffragists, along with Lucy Burns, who was there to help the women, "Now that you women are going away, I have something to say to you. The next lot of women who come here won't be treated with the same consideration that these women were." On November 14, 1917, Warden Whittaker followed through with his threat, causing the Night of Terror. Whittaker's goal was to end the 11 months of attention getting at protests and imprisonment. Burns, Paul, and other members of the National Women's Party were imprisoned at the Occoquan workhouse. While in prison, 44 club-wielding men beat, kicked, dragged, and choked their charges, which included one 73-year-old woman. Surprisingly, the pain did not stop there. The men handcuffed Burns to the bars of her cell in a painful position. They also twisted her hands and threw her on the concrete floor. Dora Lewis's head was smashed against an iron bed and she was knocked out. When Lewis's cellmate Alice Kusu saw this, she had a heart attack, thinking that Dora Lewis was dead. Then, when Alice Paul embarked on a hunger strike, the guards took a tube, forced it down her throat, and poured liquid into her until she threw up. Weeks after this torturous Night of Terror conflict, the women's experience at the workhouse got out to the press, and all the charges against the women were dropped, and the Women's Party gained more supporters for their cause. 2 months later, President Wilson publicly declared his support for the National Women's Party because he recognized the women's pain at the workhouse and in the community. Wilson awarded the suffragists the Jail for Freedom pin at a mass meeting in Belisco Theater in Washington, D.C. While the ratification of the 19th Amendment was in process, the activists continued to protest. In 1920, the greatest compromise that came out of the Night of Terror conflict was the passage of the 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote. National Women's Party's hard work in the early 1900s and success in gaining the right to vote set the tone for future rights.